Chapter 1 of the Constitution of Liberty is all about defining what liberty means. Now, it's not about defining what it should mean, right? You can choose any meaning you want for a word and use it that way. Instead, it's just about defining what Hayek means by it. Now, Hayek does a couple of different things to advance an understanding in the reader of what he means by liberty. So the first thing he does is he defines it outright. Second thing he does is he looks at other different ways liberty has been used and shows how his definition of liberty is different than those definitions of liberty. And finally, he goes to some lengths to show not that just that his idea is significantly different, but he also argues that his idea of liberty is the original meaning of liberty and what most people originally meant by liberty. So first, Hayek's definition. Someone is free if they are not subject to coercion or the arbitrary will of another or others. He doesn't talk about what coercion means in this chapter. He says he's going to wait until the beginning of part 2 to talk more specifically about coercion, but that's his basic definition. You're free if you are able to make your own choices and are not forced to do what other people want you to do. The three different definitions of liberty that he grapples with are political freedom, which I'm going to subdivide into two smaller categories: civil liberty, which he talks about, and what we can also call the right to self-determination, or national liberty, something like that, although he kind of groups them in under one thing. Inner liberty, and finally we can talk about range of choice liberty, or the ability to do what one wants as a definition of liberty. So those are the three different ideas of liberty that he says he is not talking about, and that he shows are different from his own meaning of liberty. So starting off with number 1, civil liberty. So civil liberty, for the most part, just means the idea to vote, to have a choice of the government. Hayek says this seems very clearly different from his idea of liberty, because it's entirely possible for someone to be completely and totally free in terms of their civil liberty, completely able to choose their government, but then to give away all of their other choices, to vote themselves into slavery or to become a slave by choice. And if you choose somebody to tell you everything to do, then you no longer are free from the coercion or arbitrary will of another. So you would no longer be free. The second sort of liberty he talks about under political freedom probably shouldn't be called civil liberty, but he also talks about national liberty, or the freedom of local governments to determine their own way, as opposed to having a larger world government or a larger national government determine the way that they should go. Hayek is somewhat sympathetic to this. He thinks that in general, people who are sympathetic to his idea of liberty as being a good will probably be on the side of, more local government is better. We should have nations being able to determine their own way that they should go, as opposed to someone across the sea determining your way, or something else like that, but it's still very different. The sort of national liberty is a sort of liberty for collectives, as opposed to liberty for individuals. The ability to be free from a foreign yoke and for a country to determine its own fate could still be a country determining its own fate in the way North Korea has, to give a modern example, where you have a modern government that is free from the oppression of foreign governments oppressing its own people and taking away individuals' ability to make their own decisions. Second alternate meaning of freedom that he discusses is that of inner freedom. And I think this part of the book is very interesting because it brings to my mind thoughts of modern-day behavioralist economists. So Hayek says that some people use the word freedom to mean you are free if you are free from your passions, if you are able to take a considered course of action that you've thought about without being swayed by things like laziness or things like sudden bursts of anger or fatigue or things like that. Your inner freedom comes from your self-control, your ability to set forth on a course and not be swayed from it. And the reason this makes me think of modern behavioralist economists is because that seems to be quite a bit of their focus, right? Their focus is on providing people with inner freedom, the freedom to be able to do what they really want, as opposed to having their decisions guided by some sort of heuristics or momentary passions or things like that. Again, Hayek doesn't think the use of these terms is bad, he just thinks they need to be distinguished from what he considers individual liberty, or the meaning of liberty he has. And this seems, again, very different from that. Somebody can be very inwardly free, very in control of themselves, but still subject or forced to do the will of other people instead of themselves. Finally, and probably the most pervasive, incorrect definition of liberty, or common definition of liberty, that at first seems a little bit hard to tell apart from Hayek's definition of liberty, is this idea of ability to do what you want, right? So Hayek gives the example of a mountain climber, right? And so you got someone who's climbing a mountain, and they've chosen to be on the mountain by choice. Maybe they haven't, but there's no one else around them to tell them what they do. If there's only one real course of action for them to get to the top of the mountain safely, like one safe path, that doesn't make them less free by Hayek's definition of the word freedom. Right? That person Hayek thinks is still free. In a metaphorical sense, maybe they're not free. Nature has prescribed certain paths for them. Their circumstances have, but those circumstances are not determined by a thinking mind of another in order to coerce them into doing something that the other person wants. The person is still free to pursue their own ends. So the ability to do what one wants, to give someone more and more choices, is different from freedom. Giving people power to have more choices so that they can do more things is a good thing. But it's a very different thing from individual liberty in Hayek's sense. Right? So he quotes people like Dewey, and other progressives. Dewey says something like, liberty is power. More than that, liberty is power for specific things. So as far as Dewey is concerned, you are free to do specific things when you have the option and power to do them. And you are not free to do them when it is not possible for you to do them. And it doesn't bring into the account, well, is someone stopping you from doing them? Are you unable to do them because you do not have the ability to do them innately in yourself? Are you unable to do them because you don't have the resources? It's just you're free to do something if you have the ability to, and you're unfree if you don't have the ability to. Where, in Hayek's view, there are plenty of things we don't have the ability to do. And another example he gives is a dream about flying, right? You would be more free on Dewey's view if you had the ability to fly than if you didn't. Because now you have a power that you didn't have before and an option that was unavailable to you before. But in Hayek's view, the fact that you're unable to fly doesn't make you any less free. Right? What would make you less free is if you naturally had the ability to fly or to do something else, and somebody else came in and coerced you, forced you to stop doing that by purposely manipulating you and your surroundings so that you were no longer able to do that thing. Liberty for Hayek has to do with the relationships of men to other men, he says explicitly. All right, so far this isn't really an argument for his definition being better. And he doesn't really give an argument for his definition being better. That's kind of what the rest of the book is going to be. He is just saying that his definition is different. And so that's what this next point is about for him. So it's different in that it's not even of the same species, right? So let's say you sacrificed some personal liberty or individual liberty, Hayek's definition of liberty, in order to get some civil liberty, or in order to get some of the power liberty. You might be giving up something that's good for something else that is also good. But according to Hayek, those two goods are not of the same sort at all, in any sense. They're both good, but they're both good for completely different reasons. So in Hayek's view, why is individual liberty good? Well, the reason Hayek thinks individual liberty is good is because when there's coercion, when there's someone coming in and controlling the environment or circumstances that you act not by your own plan, but by the will of another, you're violating the Kantian categorical imperative, basically. He doesn't put it that way. But basically, you're eliminating a thinking valuing person, and you're turning them into a tool for another person's plan. So there's something inherently evil about Hayek's sense of liberty being violated, because you're violating this idea of other people are thinking and valuing on your own, and you're taking that ability away from them. Now, the other sorts of liberty are good as well, but they're different sorts of good. And you may be willing to trade away some of your individual liberty for some civil liberty or inner freedom or one of those other types of liberty, but if you do so, you're getting a good that is not of the same type, but that is of a different type. He makes a brief argument here that his definition of liberty is the original one. He goes back to ancient Greece and he looks at writings that freed slaves to see what they included in them and what they didn't. And he concludes that in those writings, freeing of slaves meant for the most part, before, when you were a slave, you couldn't decide where to work, you could not decide where to live. What were the other two? You were not protected by the same laws as everybody else, and you weren't free from arbitrary arrest. So there were all these different ways in which you could be coerced. You didn't have freedom to choose these things on your own. Somebody else decided for you. Right? Where you worked was based on the arbitrary will of another. Where you lived was based on the arbitrary will of another. You could be arrested by the arbitrary will of another, etc. Now, you were allowed to own property. So that's why that wasn't included in the freeing slaves at that period of time in ancient Greece, because slaves were allowed to own property. But if you include those five things together, that is basically, its most basic level, what Hayek means by liberty. And again, he's going to talk more about what he means by coercion at the first part of chapter 2, or part 2, I mean. So much later in the book. So the other thing that I feel like I should mention, it's barely talked about in the chapter, it's a single paragraph, but it's the title of the chapter, is the idea of liberty versus liberties. So in a society where you are controlled, for the most part, you can have liberties. You are given freedom and power to do specific things, but overall you don't have freedom in the individual freedom sense of the word. Whereas in a free society, there may be certain things which you're prohibited from doing, but overall you have liberty, because for the most part you are able to make choices to do things according to your own valuations and your own thinking and your own will. Whereas in an unfree society where you're given liberties, the government comes in and gives you permission to do something in particular. And he thinks those two things really need to be sharply defined. Liberty is where you're free to do what you want. Liberties are where you're given a particular power to do something in particular, but you're not given a wide variety or a wide range of choices. Basic core thing of this chapter, he does not mean having different options available to you by liberty. Right? He thinks that he doesn't mean power. Right? A general, he says, may be very, very powerful. His decisions affect nations, but he may be less free than a common man or a shepherd or someone who's very not as well off in terms of the powers that they have and the options they can do and the things that they can affect, because his decisions are delimited by his king or his immediate supervisor and boss. Right? He has fewer freedoms about the values he can pursue and the ways that he can pursue them, even though his powers, his options, his effects on things are less limited. So that's summary of chapter 1. I think I've been calling it chapter 2 this whole time, I'm not sure. But chapter 1 of the Constitution of Liberty, liberty versus liberties. Thanks.